Subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking the subscription button below. For future webinars and online short courses, please visit our website at australianwaterschool.com.au. Welcome to this 53rd Australian Water School webinar brought to you by iSwarm. This webinar series aims to bring you many innovative ideas and projects pouring out of the global water sector. Today, we're going to look at the very important issue of groundwater governance in the Arab world, and it's presented by Dr. Alvar Closas. It's great to be here with you today. My name's Trevor Pillar. I'm National Partnerships Manager here at iSwarm and today's webinar chair. But the most important thing is look at who's here. It's just a globe of a ton of people. We really appreciate you taking the time out today to join us, and it's spread right across most continents in the world. We're going to have a good time, I'm dead sure. Here's a thought starter, straight out of Alvar's last report. The gravity and complexity of the situation requires a systematic, wide-ranging approach. Innovations in groundwater regulation and legislation must be identified to reverse or dampen the current trend of groundwater depletion and avert greater environmental and economic disaster. That's a big call, and we're going to have a good shot at that for the next hour. Stay with us. It's going to be a very good time. Look, I won't go into each one of these, but coming up between now and December, there are a number of free webinars and some online courses. I would highlight that one in yellow, Sustainable Development Goals. People are coming into that right now. But for now, let's get right into this. Presenter, Dr. Alvar Closas, is a political scientist and a human geographer. Hi, Alvar. Good to see you there. Great to see you. He works in the fields of irrigation, water resources development, and agriculture with a focus on groundwater management and governance. You can see at the end, I won't read the whole lot, but you can see at the end there that he's broadly interested in multidisciplinary and systematic approaches to water resources governance. Oh, how good that is. Multidisciplinary and systematic, and policy analysis and interaction between society, environment, and technology. That's a big call, and we're going to have a good shot at this today. Alv, what do you reckon?
Yes, we will. Thank you, Trevor, for having me, and thanks everyone for joining.
Fantastic. Before we get going, why don't we look at these questions that people have so kindly responded to. Thank you, everyone. I can see, looking at my other screen, I can see that how many have joined us now, and people have been asking these questions. What do you think of that, Alvar?
Extent to groundwater governance be improved in your region significantly. Okay, 48%.
Yeah.
Not as bad as I thought, which is good, promising. How sustainable is groundwater abstraction in your region? Somewhat sustainable. Okay, so that matches the previous answer. Barely sustainable, not sustainable at all. 16%. Okay, so there's some work to do.
You feel like it's going to be definitely worthwhile? I think it is. What extent could it be improved? What could groundwater governance be improved significantly? That's a serious number there. So thank you, everybody, for that response. It helps Alvar and us to just pitch and get this webinar useful to yourselves. That's fantastic. Right. Well, look, let's just get right into this. What do you think, Alvar? You ready to roll?
Yes. I apologize also for the background noise. I had to change locations in my flat. It's hard to avoid sound and noise in Cairo, so I apologize for any.
You look like
beeping or beeping behind me in the background.
Your vision and your sound looks like you're coming straight out of high definition Hollywood. Okay. No kidding. It's an absolutely brilliant. I'm really impressed from Cairo. It's a long distance. And look, thanks so much. We're going to hand right over to you. If you've got any questions, everybody, leave your longer questions till later. But Alvar's prepared to take questions as we go through the presentation. I'll get right out of the way. Up to you, Alvar. We're in your hands.
Okay. Yes, so I'm going to share my presentation now. Here we go. So hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are around the globe. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Trevor and iSwarm and the Australian Water School for having me. This is part of an ongoing GRIP seminar jointly organized by the International Water Management Institute and the Groundwater Solutions Initiative for Policy and Practice, which is a platform that unites several international organizations trying to come up with new solutions and practical approaches to improve groundwater management around the world. The work I'm going to present here is part of a larger project that was funded by the United States International Development Agency. It ran for around 3 years between 2014 and 2017. I would like also to acknowledge before I start the stupendous work and support by the initial project leader at the beginning of the project, François Moll, my colleague who's based in France, and he's also a main co-author for the materials I'm going to present. The presentation is basically revolves around the work that IMI has done in the Arab world, reviewing a large amount of documents and sources on policy and regulation in order to come up with relevant lessons for the region and beyond. Just a quick introduction also on what IMI stands for. IMI is an international non-for-profit research for development organization based in Sri Lanka, and we work on delivering science-based solutions to water-related challenges. The initial project for which this work was developed and that I'm presenting had a basic premise, which is basically to understand the drivers and triggers of groundwater over-abstraction. Based on this, we would define and design specific mechanisms to prevent such over-abstraction from continuously happening. The work I present here has served as basically the bedrock to develop those new and innovative approaches and the basis for understanding how groundwater is managed and how it can be improved. As I said, if people are joining again, I apologize for the background noise, as it's quite hard to get away from it in Egypt. So some of you might already know this. These are some of the main challenges that affect groundwater in the Arab world. We have, for example, well, the basic premise is that groundwater is essential for domestic and industrial supply, especially in rural areas. And I must say, though, I'm going to point out that I'm basically going to concentrate on groundwater use for irrigation and agriculture. We reviewed some cases of groundwater quality for drinking water purposes, but mostly this presentation will be focusing on irrigation and agriculture. The irrigation systems that we found in the Arab world are basically mainly based on surface water. They're receiving less water, however, as there is increasing competition with cities and climate change, and that leads to the need to complement it with groundwater, which what we would call conjunctive use. Irrigated agriculture around the region consumes around 85% of water, and it remains a strategic resource for rural livelihoods, which are not connected to specific water supply sources. Agricultural development in desert areas is based on often deep groundwater, usually non-renewable, and this is considered as a profitable venture for economic and rural development, based also on subsidized infrastructure and investment, usually sponsored by or paid for by the state. At the same time, and as I will come back to this a bit later, agricultural policies that we find in the region are often disconnected from the realities of water management and water demands. And water and agricultural ministries have inconsistent policies, if not antagonistic, meaning that they basically support, on the one hand, the development of groundwater infrastructure, and at the same time subsidize irrigated agriculture. At the same time, and as I said, we mentioned this, but we're not going to touch upon that as much, is the issue of quality degradation, salinity and contamination from agriculture and urban areas. This is a phenomenon that is linked to groundwater over-abstraction and that is undermining the security of water supply for agriculture and for drinking water in areas such as in Jordan, in Lebanon, in coastal aquifers, for example. And also the big issue of transboundary aquifers and basins, which is in one way like high-level politics, and also we're not going to touch up on that, but it's also fair to mention that there's some major transboundary aquifers that require more developed management systems between countries. A quick sort of location slide for you, if you're joining us from across the globe, to give an idea of which area we're talking about. The Middle East and North Africa region, it's roughly this area, around 420 million people living there. According to the Water Scarcity Index developed by the FAO, it's a highly stressed area, spanning from Mauritania, the west side of the Arab continent, of the African continent, to the Gulf, with withdrawals far exceeding the capacity of replenishment of fresh water sources. When it comes to irrigation and groundwater in particular, that situation becomes even more extreme, with rates of almost 80% of dependency on non-renewable sources of groundwater for irrigation. You can see the span between Egypt in this graph. 10% of Egypt's water supply for irrigation comes from groundwater, which is non-renewable. As I said, that's part of the Nubian sandstone aquifer that is shared across different countries around Egypt, all the way to Qatar and Saudi Arabia, for example, with high levels of non-renewable use of groundwater for irrigation. Which leads us to the results. And this is a common picture all over the region, from Morocco in North Africa, all the way to Jordan in the Middle East and Egypt. We can see decreasing trends of groundwater levels. The same happens in Libya and Saudi Arabia and Tunisia. So this is a common trend that, as you can see, has been evolving and happening since the mid-60s or even and 70s, all the way to now. This is coupled with when we look at this issue of groundwater governance, it's hard to decouple it from the realities on the ground, and that's where I want to add some more granularity to this presentation as part of my introduction. We have at the same time different types of aquifers that require different types of groundwater management systems. We have disparities in local situations, all the way from Saudi Arabia using deep fossil water to Morocco using very shallow and mostly conjunctive use of groundwater paired with irrigation systems using surface water. We have in Tunisia also shallow groundwater systems with some sort of recharge that happens. And we also have, in case of Jordan, some deep groundwater systems with fair amount of intralayer aquifer recharge. These present disparities and different hydrological settings are also coupled with different groundwater socio-ecologies. And that's where we bring in the human factor and the irrigation systems into the equation, that are linked to different types of resource management systems and abstraction regimes, and different irrigation typologies that will also be different. So we have, for example, some of the cases we've reviewed in Tunisia. We have a very strong presence of the state that laid out a whole irrigation network system, such as in Tunisia. We have also at the same time large private farmer investor systems, such as in Jordan. We can also find small farmer using very, very shallow water, such as in the Nile Delta in Egypt. And we could also have, as in Algeria, interesting systems of collective wells with collectively managed institutions that allow farmers of different types and sizes to access commonly drilled wells. So all of this basically to present to you that the fact that the differences in irrigation regimes and groundwater and hydrological settings add to the complexity of the issue. So this leads us to a rough typology of wells and uses for you to understand, where we're going when it comes to understanding, the different management and regulation regimes that we've reviewed for the Arab world. So based on this typology of irrigation schemes and groundwater socio-ecologies, we have a very strong presence still of state-run wells in the Middle East. This is then paired to this is in some cases just to provide public drinking water through publicly owned drinking water companies. And at the same time, the publicly irrigated areas are basically supplied by state-run wells. On the side of community wells, this is something that I'm also going to touch upon a bit later. These are, as I mentioned, cases like in Algeria, where communities themselves have basically developed and drilled their own wells, and they're being managed collectively. And then we have the largest portion of wells and types of uses of groundwater, which is private. And that, we can have all the way from agribusinesses and large business enterprises to large farmers, like individual private farmers, and the larger majority are basically continue to be small farmers involved in either conjunctive, as I said, conjunctive irrigation systems with surface and groundwater, or pure groundwater, depending irrigation schemes with shallow to like fairly deep groundwater wells. In order to add more complexity to this picture, we also have to account for the different perceptions that each of the users would bring to the table. This is linked to the different rationalities that each one of the users could have, and these actually also underlines did underline our study of groundwater governance in the region. We have all the way from specific hierarchies that we had to account for, mostly linked to relationships between users and the state. We had specific market individualism rationalities that we also have to take into account. And we have the concept that is also present in the region, which is this common pool management that is sometimes reflected in those community-based organizations and community-based cases, or also for the greater sake of the environment itself. And also we have at the bottom of the pile the issues that affect small users at the local level, such as the depletion of groundwater for specific smallholder farmers. These are farmers without the strong capacity to invest or to raise capital to continue deepening their wells. So all of these leads us to a basic framework that we used to understand the role of the state and the role of farmers and the role of communities in managing and governing groundwater. This is a common distinction that has existed in literature for some time, separating the market or private initiative with community and civil society and the state. And we've reviewed some examples of this. At this point, I would like to make sure that everyone is following, and if anyone has some pressing questions regarding some of the presentations, I'll be happy to take them in terms of clarification. If not, we can move on. Trevor?
I've noticed one, that's great, Alvar, and that last slide just really put it very clearly, that different well users don't know what the other well users are doing. It's a really good PowerPoint slide. There's one question here. Are there studies into how vast the aquifers actually are, and to what extent groundwater depletion is occurring in countries that are heavily reliant on groundwater? It's a twin.
Yes, there are, and I can provide separate references to that. The main problem that I would think as a researcher is that a lot of that data is mostly publicly provided data, and one of the main issues in the region is the lack of reliable data.
Right.
So that's a caveat that I would add whenever we discuss, official data sets on groundwater depletion in those regions. Most of it is unknown, and a lot of it is based on sparsely developed and found data sets that require more work and more resources to improve, basically.
So that's great. No, that's really good, and we can go further with that out of the session. We'll happy to send through some stuff out of the session. Let's press on, shall we? With the presentation, you're doing a great job, and thanks everybody for your questions. Keep them coming. That's really good.
Thank you, Trevor. So going back to this triangle of governance systems between the market, the community, and the state, what I'm mainly going to focus on today, for lack of time as well, is the differences between communities and state-managed groundwater systems. And I'm going to start with the state. You can see here different modalities of state intervention in this slide that basically brings us to different types of groundwater abstraction, access, and ownership of the resource itself. And this is a review that included the region, the Arab world, but also went beyond, where we can distinguish between private rights and land with some definition of reasonable use. This is usually defined through overall constraints and ends up sometimes in the courts. This is a very famous, the kind of one of the most clear examples could be, some of the states in the US, where they have a very strong private right definition of land ownership, of groundwater, which is linked to land ownership. We have also specific rights, private rights that are developed and supported by administrative right legal systems and can be prone to trading. This is a case that doesn't happen in the Arab world, where most of groundwater is ultimately owned by the state, so it's considered a public good. And we have the other issue, which is basically opposite to private rights. We found strong relevant examples of customary rights that are linked to local regulation. This is something that exists in the Arab world in conjunction with the state definition of groundwater as a public good, and this is basically in juxtaposition to the existing customary right situation, and we have cases of complementary regulations that exist, sometimes based on colonial settings like France or the UK, that overruled some of the customary rights and developed specific state defined management rules. Based on this, and we were able to identify, following our review in the Arab world, we were able to identify different types of policy tools developed by the state to regulate groundwater. So we were able to divide them into three. One is the control and abstraction of groundwater by existing wells. We sort of classified a set of specific interventions and policy tools by the state. This is paired to the fact that the state has also another option, which is, as I said, either controlling existing wells, which is tricky because there's a multiplicity of users, as I presented, and a multiplicity of situations. The government sometimes doesn't have the capacity to control existing wells. So sometimes what the governments will do, and this is again talking generally about the region, they would try to control the number and expansion of new wells. So this also comes with a list of specific policy tools and interventions that we've been able to identify across different countries in the Arab world. The third possibility that states can have, and that might resonate, as I say, beyond the Arab world, is to manage supply. And this is considered usually a more neutral political type of intervention, where basically we add water to the system and we don't upset the status quo of existing groundwater typologies of abstraction. This can either be by artificial recharge, developing or supporting harvesting structures to collect rainwater, or bring substitute surface water or treated desal water into the region by, building a plant or by developing heavy, sort of expensive infrastructure. And basically what we're going to do following this slide is understand the differences between that issues with existing wells and how we can control them, and how we can control the expansions of wells. And there's an interesting dialectic between those two. Is this figure clear, by the way, with our audience, or shall I, and can I move on?
Yeah, that's absolutely clear. Thanks very much, Alvar. I can read every single word. No, it's great. Everybody can see that, can they? Yell out if you can't, but it's very clear at my end. Thank you.
Okay, great. So moving on. This also then, so based on these policy tools, then there's specific policy objectives that will also intertwine with these types of different policy tools that we were able to identify. On the side of controlling existing wells, policy objectives that could be relevant for states in the region could be changing crops, establishing collective rules, or trying to develop micro-irrigation. On the side of the expansion of wells, we can have trying to develop further community rules or revert to rain-fed in the cases where groundwater is already too over-abstracted. And in the side of managing supply, we can either try to deepening or cleaning wells, which would allow us to pump more, or again, improving water harvesting on the surface. On the side of regulating existing wells, we are presented when we analyzed what happens in the Middle East. We are presented with three main types of wells to regulate. One is the known and legal wells. The other one is the illegal but known wells, and then the unknown and illegal wells. And this is a situation, if some of our audience members are familiar with Jordan, for example, this is a situation that sounds a bit schizophrenic, but it's the reality on the ground. So what happens with the known legal wells? Well, some of the main tools that the states have come up with is basically to meter the conditions of groundwater abstraction. And there we can find reluctance on the side of the users having to pay for the meter and install it. They fear charges, and they fear also that the meter installation will lead to restrictions. And I'll go back to this when we review the problems with enforcement regarding state policy. On the side of the known and illegal wells and the illegal unknown wells, this is an issue that can be found when wells exist before a new law, for example, or a new bylaw might be developed. There are logistic problems. There are new deadlines sometimes that are given for users with already existing wells that are illegal according to a new piece of legislation. And this can lead to specific types of regularization, authorization, or if users decide to continue within the illegality because they, again, do not trust that the state has their better interest in mind. When it comes to the other side of the control of number of existing wells, these are usually tackled through authorizations by the state. There's either authorizations for drilling, authorizations for abstraction, authorizations for modifications such as changing the depth, cleaning the well, or replacing a pump. All of these are existing situations that require a sort of an interaction between the user and the state. And again, this basically adds to the complexity of the situation on the side of the state, because there's a lot of different situations that the users will be faced with when it comes to engaging with this type of legal interactions or administrative interactions with the state. There are some exemptions sometimes, depending on the depth or type of use that groundwater would have on the type of drilling, for example. Or for the existing wells, sometimes regularization would not exist because wells would not fulfill any of the conditions, and then the users would have to be faced with either obtaining a temporary authorization or giving up on having the well as a whole. And of course, we know that this is not the case because sometimes in many cases livelihoods depend on having access to that groundwater. If we move on, so what this leads us, and I apologize, this was slightly a bit more sort of theoretical and devoid of any specific practical understanding. And this is a photograph. This is a GIS developed map of a region in Morocco called the Tadla. And as you can see, that when the reality comes in front of us, we have a very tricky situation, and that's why that presentation of the previous couple of slides was basically trying to understand this reality where you have different types of wells, different types of deeper wells, and these basically, in many cases, given the existing legal structures that have been inherited, this usually often leads to an over-allocation of permits, or the realization that the resource is usually already over-allocated because of existing historical uses. And we are faced with the issue of having to issue too many permits or the bulk, or if those permits are based on volume, there's too much volume over allocated through those permits in order to respond to the reality on the ground. This is a logistic nightmare, and I'm going to provide some examples such as Spain, and I realize that some of these examples are also outside the region, but it's always good to understand what other countries and what other areas in the world have been doing, because this is a global problem. Yeah, Trevor, come in.
Got about 5 to 10 minutes, 5 minutes 10 at maximum. We're up to the 25-minute mark. That's okay.
I might use 10 minutes, but yeah, thanks for the signal,
No
Trevor. So Spain has gone through a similar realization of problems with regulation. South Africa also has had problems with its regularization of the period that was given to users to regulate wells, given new legal frameworks, and basically ended up only with 20% of applications processed. Morocco also, has had problems, and has had gone through at least 3 different waves of regularization of wells, with the consequence that the total existing wells is at the moment unknown. Or France, also in the south of France, where only 10 to 20% of wells have been officially registered. So going back to the main focus and the main figure in this presentation, the expansion of wells is a problem. The state tries to develop prohibition zones, backfilling illegal wells, or not allowing deepening and maintenance or transfer of water across users. But again, this is without problem. This is never without problems. In this case, the larger picture basically being that wherever there is regulation on paper, and as you can see, we were able to abstract from the different types of legislations what vaguely are the main types of regulation tools and policy tools to manage groundwater in those countries. And the main issue is that there's always the same story, no? So you have everything on paper, and in my country we have excellent water laws, but the problem is implementation. However, we would say, and this is an issue that we've been able to see in the region, is that it's a myth to assume that intended changes in water management can only be made by formulating new rules. Because if those rules cannot be implemented, then there's no clear sort of mandate from the state to actually act, and then that can generate problems of legitimacy, because the users will not trust the fact that the state can issue rules and can enforce them. So this state without control or with control, as I've reviewed before, there's licenses, possibilities, there's metering, there's pricing. However, it's always usually bypassed, and we have instances of illegal drilling, corruption, meters broken, fees not recovered. So again, that issue of the enforcement without teeth is an extremely problematic issue in the region, because that leads to a lack of trust and a lack of relevant practical application of the rules by the state. So what it's usually tend to do, it's like the state tries to enforce more control, such as, for example, as I said, the fantasy of meters. It's very easy to think that meters can solve the problem, but they need investment. They usually lack cooperation from users when it comes to implementing them, and the state doesn't have enough resources to go to every single farm and install those meters. There's no control, and there's usually corruption from local officials, and that's something that cannot be avoided. And as it's usually the case, the worst of all worlds might be one where external authorities impose rules but are only able to achieve weak monitoring and sanctioning. And that's a case that we do not want to have. Such failure of state regulation, as a final sort of slide about this, is usually linked to the large number of groundwater users, inherited, historical, and new, that are outside the scope of the state and the radar of the state. The major enforcement problems that we found in the cases we've reviewed in the Arab world were due to basically a lack of staff and budget for groundwater administration. This is an issue that we think is only growing. So there's a need for a serious local and state level compact of understanding the reality and linking the future water security of countries to a further push for better budgets and better staff and better technically trained staff to understand and better manage groundwater resources. Sometimes the monitoring on the ground and enforcement is too costly, and that's a reality we have to understand. So there's possibilities to bypass such enforcement problems by using remote satellite techniques and GIS and other types of remote sensing tools that can allow us not to be underground monitoring, but still have an understanding of how much groundwater gets abstracted. The problem is usually invisible, and the changes are slow, and sometimes those changes in fluctuations in groundwater levels do not follow for example, political calendars when it comes to the politicians, promising changes in legislation, but having mandates for 3-4 years. Aquifers usually recover sometimes, and then the change again becomes less apparent. There's a policy dilemma, as I said, and that's linked to the differences between the issues between ministries, for example. When it comes to the Ministry of Agriculture supporting, subsidized irrigation, the Ministry of Environment trying to control and protect environmental flows. This issue is at its core, for example, when it comes to alleviating poverty and developing rural livelihoods. And it's a social problem that could be intensified by, for example, restricting groundwater abstraction in specifically vulnerable areas, or restricting wells in areas where, where there's like, high levels of poverty, and farmers, smallholder farmers, are really dependent on that resource. And as I said, the short-term political mandates do not match the groundwater flows, and the tough decisions are only made in crisis time, and not when the aquifers are recovering, and when we could actually start implementing, more efficient technologies, for example, or more effective legislation. The agriculture and water policy contradictions, I've already talked about that. And we cannot forget about the powerful agriculture investors that are also pumping. Those investors have huge groundwater interests, and also political interests, and also they have the ear to the politicians and to the public administrators and public officials, and those are sometimes somewhat the ones driving the depletion in some cases. Trevor, I'm going to stop here because I'm conscious of the time, and we want to leave some time for some questions. So I'm not going to proceed with my slides, and I'm going to leave it here. I apologize
No, that's all right.
to the audience because I didn't have time to. But I think it's better to leave some time for questions.
No, this is terrific. Depending on the number of questions, maybe we can come back to those slides again as well. There's a couple of questions on the board now. By all means, everybody, just click that Q&A button there and fire your questions. There's a couple there, but I think we might have time to come back to the remaining slides because they look so interesting. It's a fantastic covering. Thanks so much for this. Islam Haq in Pakistan has said, what is the policy, bring that over here, what is the policy for groundwater recharge, and how is it being carried out?
That's a great question. Thank you. So recharge is a kind of new phenomenon that the states in the Arab world are considering as the way forward, in a way. Recharge through either seasonal groundwater recharge from rainfall, or recharge mostly linked to wastewater reuse. So Jordan, for example, is extremely advanced. It's probably the most advanced country in the region, using wastewater reuse and recharge to top up the limited stock of groundwater that these countries have. Tunisia has also been doing a lot of recharge schemes from wastewater reuse. So there's a very interesting link, because basically ultimately wastewater is the new resource that is being created. So the possibilities between wastewater reuse with an increasingly urban population in the Middle East, requiring more localized groundwater use and water demand, the linkages between wastewater reuse and groundwater recharge are huge, and there's more need for that, and there's further research needed for that as well. But it's the new avenue that a lot of countries in the region are pursuing right now.
That's a great observation. The next question is, who owns the groundwater rights? It's quite a pithy question.
So I tried to cover that slightly in my slide on state types of legislation. As I said, most of the cases we've reviewed in the Middle East, the groundwater is ultimately owned by the state. So it's a public good reflected and established by law in most legislations in the Middle East. However, sorry, I was gonna clarify also that even though, so the state owns the law, by law, the state owns groundwater, and then farmers need to apply for specific authorizations or permits to use that groundwater. That doesn't mean that it always happens. And as I've mentioned, a lot of that abstraction happens outside the scope of the state by basically users drilling wells whenever they want, and drillers also not following the specific procedures highlighted by the legislation.
Yeah, that's great. There is another really interesting question here from Kumar Basin in India. In the absence of implementation plans, don't you think the rules and regulations are just as good and lead to objectives of regulation? Maybe can I ask you to open up your Q&A, open up your Q&A
Yes.
icon and have a look at this question. It goes straight to the issue of governance. The second question.
In absence of implementation plans, I don't know if I understand what implementation plan means in this case, because I mean rules and regulations would then be developed and taken by specific implementation agencies, And those implementation agencies, such as, within the Ministry of Water, for example, here in Egypt, they will have management plans for specific areas, such as the Nile Delta or the transboundary aquifer across the desert in Egypt. It is true that so I understand that issue between implementation plans following from regulation. So I would agree. I sense that there's an implied message in that question. And yes, I would agree that implementation plans are our second best when we don't have specific regulation systems in place. However, the mandate that comes from regulation and from a larger, framework that encompasses, different ministries, that is reflected in the law, for example, that requires, a larger, as I said, a larger mandate from the state, and implementation could be patchy, and will not ultimately address the larger issues that groundwater management requires, I would say, maybe.
Yep. Look, we've got 5 minutes. There is one other question there, but look, let's go on with the presentation till we hit the end. We've got another 5 to 10 minutes, and other questions will rise as you go through.
Okay.
So thanks for taking note of the timing. We do want to finish in the 1 hour to keep to our agreement. And there's questions are coming on board even as I'm speaking now, but maybe we can have just 5 minutes to round off what you were saying.
I just got another question coming in from our colleague Ashraf,
yes,
talking about related Palestinian policy and regulation in our study, and they have done a lot with this regard. I completely agree with Ashraf, and I must apologize because I didn't mention that specific special case. I did say that we reviewed the Arab world. We consciously left out Palestine from the study because of its inherent problems and the inherent conflict that Palestine is involved in with its neighbor Israel. So because of that situation, and because of the fact that there's not one without the other when it comes to policy and groundwater management, in many cases, some of the groundwater management is transboundary in that case. I have to apologize. We left it out.
But thanks, Ashraf. Thanks so much, Ashraf, for raising it, because it does. Yeah. It means that we've acknowledged the issue, and that's important. I'd say.
Yes.
Yeah. No, thanks a lot for your response to that.
So if Trevor, if you wanna, as you suggested, I can basically go back to the presentation, and because I must say we left outside of this review of state and governance. Groundwater management in the Middle East, in the Arab world, we left the community, which was the other side of that triangle that I presented.
Yep, let's do
so
that.
In this case, I'm gonna quickly glimpse over the other side of the presentation that I wanted to present, which is on community systems. There's a rich tradition and variety of practices around the world, and especially in the Arab world, where we find specific community-based irrigation systems based on springs and oases, and a lot of it precedes all the huge development of groundwater-based irrigation after the 60s and 70s. So these are the original systems that were found there, a lot of which the existing legislation and existing rules and customary rules basically are in conjunction with those. So we find that those two systems, much more structured, state-based, legislation, exists at the same time as those community systems, like that precede the modern development of groundwater. There's also a variety of local contexts. Rules are usually implemented locally and vary according to each context. Community systems can avoid conflicts, and that's something I'm going to try and maybe sort of mention quickly after this slide, is that the community systems are based on collaboration and cooperation. So conflicts are easily avoided because of the fact that the institutions have evolved through the decades and centuries to manage those conflicts and to be able to allocate water as needed. They ensure, in some cases, fair access, usually because the community of users within those community systems is mostly homogeneous. So you don't have, as happened you don't have large farmers moving in or existing at the same time as smaller farmers, smallholder farmers. This is something that has been reversed over the last 60, 50 years, where larger farmers have been able to tap into those deep groundwater fossil aquifers around those oases, for example, and they have undermined the existence and the structures that those community systems use in order to manage its collective resource. And they have been established, however, in the past, they have specific rules to manage, share, and allocate groundwater through different turns, and the systems, the socio-economic systems developed around irrigation systems in those oases are set up in order to, to give each farmer specific turns and specific timing and allocation. The investment is usually shared, and there's existing co-financing of infrastructure, be it through community-based wells or through the famous canats, or like the underground galleries that bring groundwater from specific from the water table in specific locations through to the oasis. And we have also inherited collective community systems that have been transferred to the state, or sometimes that have been inherited from families to families, and that's something that has been seen, that can be seen in Algeria. Go ahead, Trevor.
You've struck some really rich thinking in the questions that are coming through now in the Q&A. You might just see it there. Daryl Day in Australia, Managing Director of iSwarm, has asked, thinking about transboundary water sharing beyond community-based water sharing of shallow aquifers, what frameworks are available to respond to climate change?
Okay, so that's more of a more general question that I guess also requires specific attention, because the effects and climate change and issues related to climate change exist right now and will exist in the future. So the Arab region itself has specific transboundary institutions that are supposed to deal with a whole range of issues. The League of Arab States has specific committees and commissions that are used to tackle shared water management issues. And the League of Arab States is currently quite active in developing its own climate change adaptation plans. I mean, the countries are basically following suit with the larger sort of global agenda when it comes to climate change adaptation plans. And they're receiving also a lot of support from donors. So the Germans, for example, are extremely present in the region, supporting the League of Arab States in developing those climate change adaptation plans. I agree that that's the right way to do it, and we need to do more.
So there are frameworks happening.
Yes.
Daniel Pearce asked the very pithy question. He's research manager in Australia. Of all the Arab countries that have seen a significant modern expansion of groundwater use, which has been the most effective in implementing regulation, and why?
That's a great question. So I'm going to leave behind, or I'm going to leave outside the answer, the Gulf countries. The Gulf countries, as you know, are developed in some cases, like Bahrain, Qatar. They're very modern, and they have been able to develop a lot of legislation and regulation, and they've actually been quite successful. The main reason why they've been quite successful is because the number of users is very small.
Yeah. So
the government has been able to first get resources behind the legislation, and then implement it and monitor and survey the small amount of users that they have, for example, in Bahrain. In the other countries in North Africa, where the issues are more pressing and the countries have less resources and funding available, for example, I would say that Tunisia and Morocco but especially Tunisia, has had a lot of very forward-thinking legislation in order to tackle groundwater over-abstraction. They, however, require more support and more funds, for example, but they've been extremely open to consider local realities within their legislation, to consider the important role of community-based management in sharing the responsibility for improving groundwater over abstraction and for improving groundwater management. So I would say Tunisia is a really interesting case. The Palestinians, as our colleague mentioned, as Ashraf mentioned, they have tried very hard to develop some really interesting legislation and in order to tackle the huge problem that they have. Yeah, those would be a few examples that I would say.
Yep, no, that's good. We might have to keep moving pretty fast here with short answers because the questions are coming thick and fast. Trudy Evans asks an interesting question. Trudy's from Perth in Australia. What are some of the impacts from groundwater depletion to the resource, to the users, to the environment?
So that's something I sort of quickly mentioned, and maybe I should have insisted a bit more. So quantity and quality. Quantity, obviously, the depletion means that so there's an equity problem, for example, on the depletion on the quantity side, which means that the smaller holder farmers get left out. They cannot invest in deepening the wells, and therefore there's an issue, there's a transfer, or there's a loss of equity and livelihood potential based on that access to groundwater from the smallholder farmers. The larger holder farmers or private farmers, large investment farmers can continue to tap into the resource. And then we have this disparity increasing, and that's an issue that is a problem in the region where there's already huge disparities of income and livelihoods. Yep. On the quality side, salinity is a huge problem in many areas. Coastal areas where you have coastal aquifers. Most of the population in the Middle East tends to be concentrated on the coastal areas. Algeria, Lebanon, Morocco have fairly large coastal aquifers that are being extremely depleted, and with saline water, seawater intrusion, and also in areas further inland, such as in Jordan. Aquifer layers mixing, generating salinity problems. Those are huge issues that the farmers, for example, have to deal with. That requires more investment. I know even some farmers in Jordan that are investing in reverse osmosis at the farm level, installing small kits to try and tackle the increasing salinity levels. And there's an issue that also not a lot has been touched upon, and I don't know if there's a lot of research, but is pesticides and nitrates. That's an issue that is also increasing when it comes to cities, for example, having well fields shared with aquifers where there's heavy irrigation. That's an issue that is creeping in. For example, in the Nile Delta, there's problems with pesticides, and I believe there's more research needed.
Yep. No, it's obvious that you've had a big picture of this, and you could go for a lot longer than what we're going. But Kate Dowsley from Jacobs in Australia is a senior hydrogeologist. Kate says, "Hi, Alvar. How are transboundary aquifer issues managed? Are there any examples of successful management of transboundary agreements?"
So the Middle East and North Africa have a fair bunch of transboundary aquifers. The major ones are in North Africa, shared between Algeria and Tunisia, and then there's a large aquifer, the Nubian sandstone aquifer, shared between Libya, Chad, Sudan, and Egypt. And then there's small minor aquifer shared between Jordan and Saudi, and also, as we mentioned, Israel-Palestine. There's also some aquifers shared between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. There are not enough frameworks, and the frameworks that exist are not relevant enough. Data, for example, there's a couple of frameworks that enable data sharing between countries. For example, in the case of the Nubian sandstone, and in the case of a couple of transboundary aquifers between Jordan and Saudi. But data is, as I mentioned before, the lack of data or the lack of good, reliable quality data is an issue that permeates pretty much any problem related to groundwater in the region. Data is not reliable, and a lot of countries consider data as a national security issue. So they will not be willing to share data willingly or openly with other countries. So that has undermined most of the transboundary management and efforts that have been tried until now.
We're going to have to leave it at this. There's a ton more questions. What I'll do is I'll forward your questions on to Alvar, and we'll take this conversation further as the days proceed. But I just am so appreciative of your time today, Alvar, and all the effort.
Yeah, what I can do, I agree. We can basically get back to the email list, and I can spend some time like quickly try and give some pointers, and we can share the list of answers with the email listing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, Ian Marshall, Abanash, Vivek, thank you for your Badur, Al Seed, Islam Haq, thank you for your questions. I can see them there. Well, I'll get them across to Alvar. Look, all I want to say is, everyone, thanks for participating. The feedback survey will come up as soon as you close this window. There'll be a recording of this sent to you for your colleagues. There's free webinars there. I won't go into them again at the time is at a limit, but I will say that Sustainable Development Goals training course, you can see there, third from bottom, is coming up this Friday. Do join it. You are going to appreciate that. You're going to love that. Before I go, I want to say thank you to a fantastic team here at iSwarm, Dr. Ian Reid, Joel Vortman, Michelle Ha, and Claudia Alfaro, doing all the vast unseen work to make these webinars work. So thanks to that team so much. But most of all, I want to say thank you to Alvar there in Cairo. Appreciate your time and effort today. It's been a wonderful moving across a large area of work, and we wish you well in your work, and hope we can do this again in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Trevor. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Yep, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's been absolutely fantastic. See you next time. Bye.
Subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking the subscription button. For future webinars and online short courses, please visit our website at australianwaterschool.com.au.